Okay, friends, we're trying again, take 2. This is Christina at the Pacific Beach Library. We are going to read Chapter 5 of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I will catch up really fast this time on the old housekeeping stuff because in case anyone doesn't see the first video, which isn't much to it. The main parts are that there will not be a reading tomorrow. We voted not to do the reading since I've got... Oh no, wait, this is in the Gatsby group. I hope somebody's there and this is in the Gatsby group. Yay, okay, thank you. I wanted to make sure I hadn't accidentally posted to my own page again instead of the Gatsby group. Okay, so we are not doing a live reading tomorrow. I have a training that I need to attend, and in our poll, our group voted not to, just to skip tomorrow. So I'll try to find something else to post. Also, if you would like to vote on what to read next, there is still time. Next Monday is when we're going to announce the next book that we'll read following The Great Gatsby. That reading will begin on Monday, February 1st, and we will announce the winner of that poll on Monday, January 25th. So that'll be next week. So if you don't see something on that list of titles that you are either in love with or curious about, nominate something that you are in love with or you're really curious to read together. So otherwise, we'll announce on Monday next week. Okay, so now the tea, I've already poured it out. My tea is a Dorian Gray. It's a lovely tea. Just thinking about it made me want to take another sip. I haven't had an Earl Grey tea in a while. And let's talk about what happened in Chapter 4. Chapter 4 followed up Chapter 3. But Chapter 3 had been where we saw the amazingly elaborate party at the home of Jay Gatsby that Nick Carraway attended. Chapter 4 starts out with the timeline kind of moving around again. Instead of following, hello, thank you guys, all of you who came over to the second video. Sorry about the losing the connection, the first one. Let's hope this one works. Fingers crossed. Let's see. This one starts out with Nick Carraway looking back at some old notes that he had written back in 1922 when the events of the story happened. We don't know how far back Nick Carraway is looking back. We know the book came out in 1925. So for readers who are looking at this, the events have probably only happened just a few years after the story came, would have been written just a few years after the event. So it's not like it was looking back 50 years later, just within a few years, but still. There's a bit of time there. So Nick Carraway starts out by talking about the many, many different people, and he name drops a ton of people. I assume some of these are actually real people who visited the home of Gatsby. And again, based on what we saw in Chapter 3, the implication to me at least is that these are people who came to the home of Jay Gatsby, came to the party of Jay Gatsby, but were not intimate friends and acquaintances of Jay Gatsby. That they didn't really know him well. They didn't care to know him well. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Pam, for letting me know this one is working better. I'm glad this feed is working better. Okay, so the story just resumes with a morning in late July when Gatsby pulls up to visit with Nick Carraway. And so we know that at this point they've already had that, was it hydroplaning or whatever they were going to do? They had some sort of engagement after that party. They had done a few other things together, and now they're driving up in Gatsby's beautiful sports car over to the city. Hydroplane, that's what it was. And he had used the beach frequently, so they've furthered that acquaintance. They've furthered that relationship. And Gatsby starts out with having an interesting conversation with Nick Carraway where basically says, I don't want you to get a wrong idea of me from all the stories you hear. And we know that there's a lot of weird stories going around about Gatsby because he's mysterious. He doesn't talk to a lot of people. People speculate as to what he is. Is he a bootlegger? Is he some other sort of criminals? Was he involved with the Kaiser, with the Germans in World War I? Is he, is there something nefarious about him? Has he killed a man? All these different things. Thank you. I like the hat too. Let's see. So there's all this speculation about Gatsby. And he says, I don't want you to get a wrong idea of me, so I'm going to tell you the God's truth. He then proceeds to tell him some things that are interesting. That he's the son of a wealthy family from the Middle West, that they're all dead. He was brought up in America but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors have been educated there for years. It is a family tradition. Now, as he says these things, Nick Carraway sort of hears the way he says it. And he just gets this feeling that Gatsby is lying or exaggerating. And he says that he could tell why Jordan Baker believed that Gatsby was lying. The way he said that he was educated at Oxford, it just doesn't ring true. There's something weird about it. Also, he says he's from the Midwest. And he's like, where in the Midwest are you from? San Francisco. Now, I read in another thing that could be a sign that Gatsby is lying, or it could be a sign that F. Scott Fitzgerald had a really poor understanding of geography. So that's a little unsure, but for those of us who are looking at it, I think it indicates a bit of the lying also. He says how his family died, he got a great deal of money, he was at Oxford, and then he got involved with the war, and, you know, he did all these different things, and as he's saying all this glorious story of his history, Nick Carraway's sort of listening to him like, yeah, right. And then he says, like, you know, for my valor in the war, I was awarded these different decorations, including this medal from Montenegro. And then he pulls out of his pocket an actual medal, from Montenegro, awarded to Major J. Gatsby for valor extraordinary. And when he sees that, suddenly this image that Nick Carraway has of J. Gatsby, of this man who is quite wealthy but obviously lying about his past, it suddenly changes. Gatsby also shows Nick a photo of him at Oxford from when he was a student, and he recognizes Gatsby, clearly a little younger, but clearly Gatsby at Oxford. And suddenly it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in the palace on the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies with ease, or rubies to ease, with the crimson lighted depths, the gnawings of his broken heart. And so suddenly, because of these bits of corroboration, he's forced to believe the truer, larger story of J. Gatsby, of this tale that he's spinning about his past. And Gatsby says there's something that, you know, he had, part of the reason he'd fled to the continent was he was fleeing something sad that had happened to him long ago. And he says, he continues his story saying, there's something I want to ask of you to help me. You'll hear about it this afternoon. I'm not going to tell you myself. Your friend Jordan Baker is going to tell you. And it's like, well, is it that you're in love with Jordan? It's like, no, there's something completely else. And it's rather odd. And Nick Carraway takes a little bit of offense that rather than just telling him himself, Jay Gatsby has asked Jordan Baker to speak to Nick, and he doesn't quite understand it. They end up going over, though, they meet somebody for lunch, and this gentleman is named Mr. Wolfsheim. Mr. Wolfsheim, there's a couple little signs in there, too, that there's something interesting about him as well. He talks about some folks who had had some problems, somebody who was shot. He talks about, he mispronounces Oxford. Instead, he says Ogsford, like Oggsford. He talks about a connection, but instead it's a connection. So it's these little signs that there's something a little lower class about Mr. Wolfsheim. And then later on, Gatsby actually says that Mr. Wolfsheim is a gambler. And in fact, he is the man who fixed the World Series back in 1919, so with the Black Sox scandal. And so we know that Mr. Wolfsheim has some criminal aspects to him and that he is an associate of Jay Gatsby. Their lunch concludes pretty much when Nick Carraway cites Tom Buchanan coming in. And Tom Buchanan asked Nick Carraway asked Jay Gatsby to go with him to say hello to Tom. But when he turns, he says, I've been having lunch with with Mr. Gatsby, and he turns to introduce him, Gatsby's gone. So the story just picks up again with Nick Carraway talking to Jordan Baker. And she relates how back in the October of 1917, so almost 5 years prior, that she had been a younger friend of Daisy Buchanan before she married, so she was still Daisy Faye at that point. The two of them, they lived in Louisville in Kentucky, and that one day she had spotted Daisy having a romantic moment with a young man who was in the army named Jay Gatsby. And she didn't realize for a long time that it was the same gentleman that was now living near them in West Egg. Daisy, she saw that there was this romantic moment with Daisy and Jay. But then, he left. And Daisy was very sad about it for a while. But then, time passed. Daisy ended up finding somebody else. She ends up getting married or getting engaged to Tom Buchanan. On the verge of the wedding, she's drunk, though. She's depressed, and she's saying that she wants to cancel it off. She says Daisy has changed her mind. She doesn't want to marry it, and she's married Tom, and she's crying and weeping and wailing. And she's holding a letter. And she doesn't let anyone else read the letter. The letter, she actually gets it wet in the bathtub, squeezes it up, and when it disintegrates, only then does she let it go. So we don't learn what was in the letter at this point. Daisy does change her mind, though. After she sobers up, she ends up marrying Tom Buchanan, and they go off on their trip to the South Seas. They're quite happy together. They seem to be very happy indeed, until a while later, Tom is involved in a car accident, yet another car accident in the story. And when he's involved in the car accident, a wheel is ripped off the car, and it gets into the newspapers because there was a chambermaid with him from the hotel where Daisy and Tom were staying. That's how it's revealed that Tom has been cheating on Daisy, and that's where we start seeing a rift in their marriage. Daisy, a few months after that, or almost, that was in August, and in April, let me do my math, the next year, Daisy has her little girl in April, and they seem to be doing well with each other, Tom and Daisy. Jordan's telling the story. Daisy seems to be popular. She seems to be happy. She, unlike the rest of the crowd, doesn't drink as much, but, she seems to go in well for them all. And then something happened. That 6 weeks ago, Daisy heard the name Gatsby for the first time when Nick was at that dinner party at Daisy and Tom's house with Jordan Baker. And afterwards, Daisy came up to Jordan and asked, tell me more about this man. And that's when they realized it was the same man whom Daisy had knew 5 years before in 1917. So the story wraps up with Jordan saying that, that they had known each other. And Nick says, wow, what a strange coincidence. She's like, oh, no, not a coincidence at all. Gatsby bought the house that he did so that Daisy would be just across the bay. And in fact, he had thrown these parties over the years so that he was hoping that it might attract Daisy to come to one of these parties one of these days. And in fact, he has now asked Jordan to ask Nick if he would be so kind as to invite his cousin Daisy over to his home so that Daisy would come to Nick's house and then see Gatsby's mansion next door. And Nick is like, well, this is so convoluted. Why didn't he just ask me himself? Why are you asking me? And it's like, well, he's afraid. He's waited so long. He thought you might be offended. Let's see. There's also a bit more just about Gatsby's obsessive love of Daisy. It says that, he doesn't know much about Tom, although he's read a Chicago paper for years just on the chance of catching a glimpse of Daisy's name. So it's both very romantic and sweet and also a little obsessive and weird. There's an interesting line, too. A phrase began to beat in Nick's ears with a sort of heady excitement. There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired. And Jordan continues, too, that Daisy ought to have something in her life. And, well, does she want to see Gatsby? She's not to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. You're just supposed to invite her to tea, and it'll be a surprise. The chapter, though, ends on an interesting note where Nick is saying how he's walking by and he sees a block of delicate pale light beam down into the park. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices and the blinding signs, and so I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms. Her wan, scornful mouth smiled, and so I drew her up again closer, this time to my face. And so that idea again, too, that Gatsby and Tom have this strong and maybe perhaps a little bit obsessive love that Nick Carraway doesn't feel, that he's a bit more passive, I'm guessing is how I describe it. And I have gone a little too far. Here we go. Now I've marked off chapter 6. So let's go ahead and start with chapter 5 of our book. Today's a little bit of a shorter chapter, which is fine since we had a little mess up and we're on a second video already. All right, so chapter 5 of The Great Gatsby. When I came home to West Egg that night, I was afraid for a moment that my house was on fire. 2 o'clock and the whole corner of the peninsula was blazing with light, which fell unreal on the shrubbery and made thin, elongating glints upon the roadside wires. Turning a corner, I saw that it was Gatsby's house, lit from tower to cellar. At first, I thought it was another party, a wild rout that had resolved itself into hide-and-go-seek or sardines in the box, with all the house thrown open to the game. But there wasn't a sound, only wind in the trees, which blew the wires and made the lights go off and on again, as if the house had winked into the darkness. As my taxi groaned away, I saw Gatsby walking toward me across his lawn. "Your place looks like the World's Fair," I said. "Does it?" He turned his eyes toward it absently. "I have been glancing into some of the rooms. Let's go to Coney Island, old sport. In my car. It's too late. Well, suppose we take a plunge in the swimming pool. I haven't made use of it all summer. I've got to go to bed. All right. He waited, looking at me with suppressed eagerness. I talked with Miss Baker, I said after a moment. I'm going to call up Daisy tomorrow and invite her over here to tea. Oh, that's all right, he said carelessly. I don't want to put you to any trouble. What day would suit you? What day would suit you? He corrected me quickly. I don't want to put you to any trouble, you see. How about the day after tomorrow? He considered for a moment, then, with reluctance, I want to get the grass cut, he said. We both looked at the grass. There was a sharp line where my ragged lawn ended, and the darker, well-kept expanse of his began. I suspected that he meant my grass. There's another little thing, he said uncertainly, and hesitated. Would you rather put it off for a few days? I asked. Oh, it isn't about that. At least, he fumbled with a series of beginnings. Why, look here, old sport. You don't make much money, do you? Not very much. This seemed to reassure him, and he continued more confidently. I thought you didn't, if you'll pardon my... You see, I carry on a little business on the side, a sort of sideline, you understand. And I thought if you don't make very much, you're selling bonds, aren't you, old sport? Trying to. Well, this would interest you. It wouldn't take up much of your time, and you might pick up a nice bit of money. It happens to be a rather confidential sort of thing. I realize now that under different circumstances, that conversation might have been one of the crises of my life. But because the offer was obviously and tactlessly for a service to be rendered, I had no choice except to cut him off there. I've got my hands full, I said. I'm much obliged, but I couldn't take on any more work. You wouldn't have to do any business with Wolfsheim. Evidently he thought that I was shying away from the connection mentioned at lunch, but I assured him he was wrong. He waited a moment longer, hoping I'd begin a conversation, but I was too absorbed to be responsive, so he went unwillingly home. The evening had made me lightheaded and happy. I think I walked into a deep sleep as I entered my front door. So I don't know whether or not Gatsby went to Coney Island or for how many hours he glanced into rooms while his house blazed gaudily on. I called up Daisy from the office next morning and invited her to come to tea. Don't bring Tom, I warned her. What? Don't bring Tom. Who is Tom? She asked innocently. The day agreed upon was pouring rain. At 11 o'clock, a man in a raincoat, dragging a lawnmower, tapped at my front door and said that Mr. Gatsby had sent him over to cut my grass. That reminded me that I had forgot to tell my Finn to come back, so I drove into West Egg Village to search for her among soggy, whitewashed alleys and to buy some cups and lemons and flowers. The flowers were unnecessary, for at 2 o'clock a greenhouse arrived from Gatsby's with innumerable receptacles to contain it. An hour later, the front door opened nervously, and Gatsby, in a white flannel suit, silver shirt, and gold-colored tie, hurried in. He was pale, and there were dark signs of sleeplessness beneath his eyes. Is everything all right? He asked immediately. The grass looks fine, if that's what you mean. What grass? He inquired blankly. Oh, the grass in the yard. He looked out the window at it, but, judging from his expression, I don't believe he saw a thing. Looks very good, he remarked vaguely. One of the papers said they thought the rain would stop about 4. I think it was the Journal. Have you got everything you need in the shape of tea? I took him into the pantry, where he looked a little reproachfully at the Finn. Together we scrutinized the 12 lemon cakes from the delicatessen shop. Will they do? I asked. Of course. They're fine. And he added hollowly, old sport. The rain cooled about 3:30 to a damp mist, through which occasional thin drops swam like dew. Gatsby looked with vacant eyes through a copy of Clay's Economics, starting at the finished tread that shook the kitchen floor, and peering through the bleared windows from time to time as if a series of invisible but alarming happenings were taking place outside. Finally, he got up and informed me in an uncertain voice that he was going home. Why is that? Nobody's coming to tea. It's too late. He looked at his watch as if there was some pressing demand on his time elsewhere. I can't wait all day? Don't be silly. It's just 2 minutes to 4. He sat down miserably as if I had pushed him, and simultaneously there was the sound of a motor turning into my lane. We both jumped up, and, a little harrowed myself, I went out into the yard. Under the dripping bare lilac trees, a large open car was coming up the drive. It stopped. Daisy's face, tipped sideways beneath a 3-cornered lavender hat, looked out at me with a bright, ecstatic smile. Is this absolutely where you live, my dearest one? The exhilarating ripple of her voice was a wild tonic in the rain. I had to follow the sound of it for a moment, up and down with my ear alone, before any words came through. A damp streak of hair lay like a dash of blue paint across her cheek, and her hand was wet with glistening drops as I took it to help her from the car. Are you in love with me? She said low in my ear. Or why did I have to come alone? That's the secret of Castle Rack Rent. Tell your chauffeur to go far away and spend an hour. Come here in an hour, Ferdy. Then, in a grave murmur, his name is Ferdy. Does the gasoline affect his nose? I don't think so, she said innocently. Why? We went in. To my overwhelming surprise, the living room was deserted. Well, that's funny, I exclaimed. What's funny? She turned her head as there was a light, dignified knocking at the front door. I went out and opened it. Gatsby, pale as death, with his hands plunged like weights in his coat pockets, was standing in a puddle of water, glaring tragically into my eyes. With his hands still in his coat pockets, he stalked by me into the hall, turned sharply as if he were on a wire, and disappeared into the living room. It wasn't a bit funny. Aware of the loud beating of my own heart, I pulled the door to against the increasing rain. For half a minute, there wasn't a sound. Then from the living room, I heard a sort of choking murmur and part of a laugh, followed by Daisy's voice on a clear, artificial note. I certainly am awfully glad to see you again. A pause. It endured horribly. I had nothing to do in the hall, so I went into the room. Gatsby, his hands still in his pockets, was reclining against the mantelpiece in a strained counterfeit of perfect ease, even of boredom. His head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of a defunct mantelpiece clock, and from this position his distraught eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting, frightened but graceful, on the edge of a stiff chair. We've met before, muttered Gatsby. His eyes glanced momentarily at me, and his lips parted with an abortive attempt at a laugh. Luckily, the clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his head, whereupon he turned and caught it with trembling fingers and set it back in place. Then he sat down rigidly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand. I'm sorry about the clock, he said. My own face had now assumed a deep tropical burn. I couldn't muster up a single commonplace out of the 1,000 in my head. It's an old clock, I told them idiotically. I think we all believed for a moment that it had smashed in pieces on the floor. We haven't met for many years, said Daisy, her voice as matter-of-fact as it could ever be. 5 years, next November. The automatic quality of Gatsby's answer set us all back at least another minute. I had them both on their feet with the desperate suggestion that they help me make tea in the kitchen when the demonic Finn brought it in on a tray. Amid the welcoming confusion of cups and cakes, a certain physical decency established itself. Gatsby got himself into a shadow, and, while Daisy and I talked, looked conscientiously from one to the other of us with tense, unhappy eyes. However, as calmness wasn't an end in itself, I made an excuse at the first possible moment and got to my feet. "Where are you going?" demanded Gatsby in immediate alarm. "I'll be back." "I've got to speak to you about something before you go." He followed me wildly into the kitchen, closed the door, and whispered, "Oh, God," in a miserable way. "What's the matter?" "This is a terrible mistake," he said, shaking his head from side to side. "A terrible, terrible mistake." "You're just embarrassed, that's all." And luckily I added, "Daisy's embarrassed too." "She's embarrassed?" he repeated incredulously. "Just as much as you are." "Don't talk so loud." "You're acting like a little boy," I broke out impatiently. "Not only that, but you're rude. Daisy's sitting in there all alone." He raised his hand to stop my words, looked at me with unforgettable reproach, and, opening the door cautiously, went back into the other room. I walked out the back way, just as Gatsby had when he had made his nervous circuit of the house half an hour before, and ran for a huge black knotted tree whose massed leaves made a fabric against the rain. Once more it was pouring, and my irregular lawn, well shaved by Gatsby's gardener, abounded in small muddy swamps and prehistoric marshes. There was nothing to look at from under the tree except Gatsby's enormous house, so I stared at it like Kant at his church steeple for half an hour. A brewer had built it early in the period craze a decade before, and there was a story that he'd agreed to pay 5 years' taxes on all the neighboring cottages if the owners would have their roofs thatched with straw. Perhaps their refusal took the heart out of his plan to found a family. He went into an immediate decline. His children sold his house with the black wreath still on the door. Americans, while occasionally willing to be serfs, have always been obstinate about being peasantry. After half an hour, the sun shone again, and the grocer's automobile rounded Gatsby's drive with the raw material for his servant's dinner. I felt sure he wouldn't eat a spoonful. A maid began opening the upper windows of his house, appeared momentarily in each, and leaning from a large central bay, spat meditatively into the garden. It was time I went back. While the rain continued, it had seemed like the murmur of their voices, rising and swelling a little now and then with gusts of emotion. But in the new silence, I felt that silence had fallen within the house, too. I went in, after making every possible noise in the kitchen, short of pushing over the stove, but I don't believe they heard a sound. They were sitting at either end of the couch, looking at each other as if some question had been asked or was in the air, and every vestige of embarrassment was gone. Daisy's face was smeared with tears, and when I came in, she jumped up and began wiping at it with her handkerchief before a mirror. But there was a change in Gatsby that was simply confounding. He literally glowed. Without a word or a gesture of exultation, a new well-being radiated from him and filled the little room. "Oh, hello, old sport," he said, as if he hadn't seen me for years. I thought for a moment he was going to shake hands. "It's stopped raining." "Has it?" When he realized what I was talking about, that there were twinkle bells of sunshine in the room, he smiled like a weatherman, like an ecstatic patron of recurrent light, and repeated the news to Daisy. "What do you think of that? It's stopped raining." "I'm glad, Jay." Her throat, full of aching, grieving beauty, told only of her unexpected joy. "I want you and Daisy to come over to my house," he said. "I'd like to show her around." "You're sure you want me to come?" "Absolutely, old sport." Daisy went upstairs to wash her face. Too late, I thought with humiliation of my towels, while Gatsby and I waited on the lawn. "My house looks well, doesn't it?" he demanded. "See how the whole front of it catches the light?" I agreed that it was splendid. Yes. His eyes went over it. every arched door and square tower. It took me just 3 years to earn the money that bought it." "I thought you inherited your money." "I did, old sport," he said automatically, "but I lost most of it in the big panic, the panic of the war." I think he hardly knew what he was saying, for when I asked him what business he was in, he answered, "That's my affair," before he realized that it wasn't an appropriate reply. "Oh, I've been in several things," he corrected himself. "I was in the drug business, and then I was in the oil business, but I'm not in either one now." He looked at me with more attention. "Do you mean you've been thinking over what I proposed the other night?" Before I could answer, Daisy came out of the house, and 2 rows of brass buttons on her dress gleamed in the sunlight. "That huge place there?" she cried, pointing. "Do you like it?" "I love it, but I don't see how you live there all alone." "I keep it always full of interesting people, night and day. People who do interesting things. Celebrated people." Instead of taking the short cut along the Sound, we went down to the road and entered by the big postern. With enchanting murmurs, Daisy admired this aspect or that of the feudal silhouette against the sky, admired the gardens, the sparkling odor of jonquils, and the frothy odor of hawthorn and plum blossoms, and the pale gold odor of kiss me at the gate. It was strange to reach the marble steps and find no stir of bright dresses in and out the door, and hear no sound but bird voices in the trees. And inside, as we wandered through Marie Antoinette music rooms and restoration salons, I felt that there were guests concealed behind every couch and table under orders to be breathlessly silent until we had passed through. As Gatsby closed the doors of the Merton College Library, I could have sworn I heard the owl-eyed man break into ghostly laughter. We went upstairs, through period bedrooms swathed in rose and lavender silk and vivid with new flowers, through dressing rooms and pool rooms and bathrooms with sunken baths, intruding into one chamber where a disheveled man in pajamas was doing liver exercises on the floor. It was Mr. Klipspringer, the boarder. I had seen him wandering hungrily about the beach that morning. Finally, we came to Gatsby's own apartment, a bedroom and a bath, and an Adam's study where we sat down and drank a glass of some chartreuse he took from a cupboard in the wall. He hadn't once ceased looking at Daisy, and I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. Sometimes, too, he stared around at his possessions in a dazed way, as though in her actual and astounding presence, none of it was any longer real. Once, he nearly toppled down a flight of stairs. His bedroom was the simplest room of all, except where the dresser was garnished with a toilette set of pure, dull gold. Daisy took the brush with delight and smoothed her hair, whereupon Gatsby sat down and shaded his eyes and began to laugh. "It's the funniest thing, old sport," he said hilariously. "I can't. When I try to—" He had passed visibly through 2 states and was entering upon a 3rd. After his embarrassment and his unreasoning joy, he was consumed with wonder at her presence. He had been full of the idea so long, dreamed it right through to the end, waited with his teeth set, so to speak, at an inconceivable pitch of intensity. Now, in the reaction, he was running down like an overwound clock. Recovering himself in a minute, he opened for us 2 hulking patent cabinets, which held his massed suits and dressing gowns and ties, and his shirts piled like bricks in stacks a dozen high. "I've got a man in England who buys me clothes. He sends over a selection of things at the beginning of each season, spring and fall." He took out a pile of shirts and began throwing them, one by one, before us, shirts of sheer linen and thick silk and fine flannel, which lost their folds as they fell and covered the table in many-colored disarray. While we admired, he brought more, and the soft, rich heap mounted higher, shirts with stripes and scrolls and plaids in coral and apple green and lavender and faint orange, with monograms of Indian blue. Suddenly, with a strained sound, Daisy bent her head into the shirts and began to cry stormily. "They're such beautiful shirts," she sobbed, her voice muffled in the thick folds. "It makes me sad because I've never seen such beautiful shirts before." After the house, we were to see the grounds and the swimming pool and the hydroplane and the midsummer flowers. But outside Gatsby's window it began to rain again, so we stood in a row looking at the corrugated surface of the Sound. "If it wasn't for the mist, we could see your home across the bay," said Gatsby. "You always have a green light that burns all night at the end of your dock." Daisy put her arm through his abruptly, but he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to the great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now it was again a green light on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by one. I began to walk about the room, examining various indefinite objects in the half-darkness. A large photograph of an elderly man in yachting costume attracted me, hung on the wall over his desk. "Who's this?" That's Mr. Dan Cody, old sport." The name sounded vaguely familiar. "He's dead now. He used to be my best friend years ago." There was a small picture of Gatsby, also in yachting costume, on the bureau. Gatsby, with his head thrown back defiantly, taken apparently when he was about 18. "I adore it!" exclaimed Daisy. "The pompadour! You never told me you had a pompadour, or a yacht." "Look at this," said Gatsby quickly. "Here's a lot of clippings. About you." They stood side by side examining it. I was going to ask to see the rubies when the phone rang, and Gatsby took up the receiver. "Yes. Well, I can't talk now. I can't talk now, old sport." "I said a small town. He must know what a small town is." "Well, he's no use to us if Detroit is his idea of a small town." He rang off. "Come here quick!" cried Daisy at the window. The rain was still falling, but the darkness had parted in the west, and there was a pink and golden billow of foamy clouds above the sea. "Look at that," she whispered, and then after a moment, "I'd like to just get one of those pink clouds and put you in it and push you around." I tried to go then, but they wouldn't hear of it. Perhaps my presence made them feel more satisfactorily alone. "I know what we'll do," said Gatsby. "We'll have Klipspringer play the piano." He went out of the room calling, "Ewing!" and returned in a few minutes, accompanied by an embarrassed, slightly worn young man with shell-rimmed glasses and scanty blonde hair. He was now decently clothed in a sport shirt, open at the neck, sneakers, and duck trousers of a nebulous hue. "Did we interrupt your exercises?" inquired Daisy politely. "I was asleep," cried Mr. Klipspringer in a spasm of embarrassment. "That is, I'd been asleep. Then I got up." "Klipspringer plays the piano," said Gatsby, cutting him off. "Don't you, Ewing, old sport?" "I don't play well. I hardly play at all. I'm all out of practice." "Well, go downstairs," interrupted Gatsby. He flipped a switch. The gray windows disappeared as the house glowed full of light. In the music room, Gatsby turned on a solitary lamp beside the piano. He lit Daisy's cigarette from a trembling match and sat down with her on a couch far across the room where there was no light save what the gleaming floor bounced in from the hall. When Klipspringer had played The Love Nest, he turned around on the bench and searched unhappily for Gatsby in the gloom. "I'm all out of practice, you see. I told you I couldn't play. I'm all out of practice." "Don't talk so much, old sport," commanded Gatsby. "Play." "In the morning, in the evening, ain't we got fun?" Outside the wind was loud, and there was a faint flow of thunder along the Sound. All the lights were going on in West Egg now. The electric trains, men carrying, were plunging home through the rain from New York. It was the hour of a profound human change, and excitement was generating on the air. One thing sure and never sure, the rich get poor and the poor get children. In the meantime, in between time, as I went over to say goodbye, I saw that the expression of bewilderment had come back into Gatsby's face, as though a faint doubt had occurred to him as to the quality of his present happiness. Almost 5 years! There must have been moments even that afternoon when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams, not through her own fault, but because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. It had gone beyond her, beyond everything. He had thrown himself into it with a creative passion, adding to it all the time, decking it out with every bright feather that drifted his way. No amount of fire or freshness can challenge what a man will store up in his ghostly heart. As I watched him, he adjusted himself a little, visibly. His hand took hold of hers, and as she said something low in his ear, he turned toward her with a rush of emotion. I think that voice held him most, with its fluctuating, feverish warmth, because it couldn't be overdreamed. That voice was a deathless song. They had forgotten me, but Daisy glanced up and held out her hand. Gatsby didn't know me now at all. I looked once more at them, and they looked back at me, remotely, possessed by intense life. Then I went out of the room and down the marble steps into the rain, leaving them there together. That concludes Chapter 5 of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. We'll talk a little bit more about it tomorrow. We will not talk about it tomorrow. Tomorrow we're not reading together. We'll read Chapter 6 on Thursday. It's such a beautiful scene. After all those dreams and hopes and building, it's nice to see this moment where Jay Gatsby finally gets to see Daisy. Oh, it's a beautiful moment. Okay, we'll continue with our reading on Thursday. Until then, thank you very much for joining me today. If you would still like to vote on what we'll read next, please go in and do that. And hope all your dreams come true. We'll see you again on Thursday. Bye, friends.